Hello, guys. This is your a overview of Chapter 5 for you guys. Let me one more time pause here and see if it's recording. Okay, it's recording. Volume is on. Alrighty, so Chapter 5 is a continuation of discussion about ecosystems. If you guys remember, Chapter 4 was also ecosystem discussions, but Chapter 4 concentrated on all the abiotic factors in the ecosystem, right? Chemical cycles and weather patterns, geological activities, and how it affects human beings and other organisms and the discussion also proceeded into how human activities can also unbalance those abiotic cycles and factors. In this chapter, we are going to discuss the living organisms, which is the biotic factors, right, in an ecosystem. So we will talk about organisms at the population level. We will talk about them at the community level. And the discussion, though, in this chapter starts off with evolution because the premise here is that there are many, many, many different kinds of living life out there. And the diversity in the living world, we are still finding out how diverse life forms are on this planet. And we are trying to classify them to make our view of them simpler. So we can regard them in groups of similarities, dissimilarities, and to make things easier for us. But then if you ask the question, where does all this diversity come from? Diversity in structure, diversity in function, which is what they do. Who they interact with is very diverse too. So interactions between organisms is diverse. And because of organisms' diverse capability is what then makes possible for our ecosystem to provide all those different services ecosystems provide us: food, water, shelter, proper rainfall, soil fertility, and you can keep naming a lot of different characteristics that because of organisms' contributions is why it's possible. So to start off, right, this chapter, we are going to first discuss population, or the chapter is going to start off with population ecology. But before we talk about it, we will talk about the importance of, or not we will talk about it, but the chapter discusses the importance of evolution in creating diversity. And then, of course, then the chapter slips into discussion about principles of population ecology and about community structures and about species richness in community, what determines it, and how does a community of organisms in a particular ecosystem develop over time. Okay, so this is the outline of the chapter. And of course, as usual, chapter starts off with a case study. Please make sure you kind of are aware of it and read through it. So evolution, again, you guys might have heard about Charles Darwin and how he is considered the father of evolution. Whenever you hear a scientist's name, please do not think they were the first people to discuss it or study the phenomena. Most of the time, the people that you hear about in textbooks are the people who finally found evidence for what we are talking about. So even before Charles Darwin, a lot of individuals discussed the concept of evolution, or what we call evolution nowadays, but they really did not have scientific evidence, the proof needed to validate their hypothetical assumptions. Does that make sense? And you all know scientific method requires that we have data that we can go back and we can check. So when Charles Darwin first came up with data for what he was proposing, then Charles Darwin's work became the first most important relevant work, right? So learn about what evolution is. Evolution starts at the genetic level. So genes change over time, and the genetic changes then allows us to some organisms within a population to be a lot more adapted, better adapted to the struggles of existence than organisms that are not genetically programmed to do it. mutation is not a voluntary process. We don't do it purposefully. You can't walk out tomorrow and say, I'm sick and tired of not getting a good tan, so I'm going to mutate my genes so I can get a nice golden tan. You can't do that any more than organisms can say, I'm going to develop a thick fur coat. So it's not a conscious process, but mutation is a phenomena that you and I cannot deny. It happens, right? And when mutation happens, then genes change. The genetic changes can go any way depending on what genetic change happened to those genes. Mutations can lead to harmful effects. Mutation can also lead to beneficial effects. Mutation can lead to changes that really doesn't affect an organism's survival rate. For example, the original gene for human hair color is dark hair, right? Like this, what I have. Every other hair color is a mutated version of this particular original hair color. But that doesn't mean that people with dark hair color have somehow figured out how to survive better and have better success in life in terms of species, right? Furthering the gene pool than people with any other hair color. You guys know it. And mutations is what gave rise to the different heights we have, the different bone structures we have, the different eye colors we have, right? Metabolism, right? We all vary in metabolism, and you really don't have to be in abnormal metabolic state to have different metabolism than others. But then there are mutations that can lead to a lot of harm, because any mutation that keeps a organism from successfully passing on genes to the next generation is a mutation that could lead to evolutionary changes. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay. So the premise here is any mutation that allows an organism to survive better in the particular environment it's living in right now, which then conveys to you the message that that environment could change at any time, and those set of characteristics might not be useful at that time. But at this given snapshot in time, these set of characteristics allows this organism to survive better and successfully reproduce and pass on genes to the next generation. And those organisms that don't have those collection of genes, because when their parents underwent sexual reproduction and passed on genes to them, the set of genes they passed on to them is not really helping them to survive the environment they are in, then those organisms' chances to pass on genes to the next generation kind of starts taking a hit. And so over time, the set of genes that really helps the organism be successful, their frequency goes up. Those genes that keeps the organism from successful life keeps coming down. And many eons later, you could have an organism that do tend to look very different from where its ancestors. So while the ancestors really didn't didn't really perish, these organisms do independently evolve over time. And when the ancestral species and the descendant species start having enough genetic differences that at the chromosome level that they cannot anymore interact with one another, we consider them different species, right? So a species is a group of organisms that can freely and successfully interbreed, because at the chromosome level they can talk. Because in sexual reproduction, if you guys remember from previous chapters, only one parent can provide only half of the genetic material. The other half to make this genetic material whole has to come from the other parent, if you remember, right? So in sexual reproduction, when two species involved in reproduction at the chromosome level, that if they're not compatible, then we call them two different species, right? So evolutionary changes, we can't stop them. We can't direct them either. You can say, well, this organism will adapt over time to the changes. It might not. We cannot really really choreograph it. Just like I told you, we cannot really direct our mutations, right? Mutations can happen naturally. Mutations can be induced because of our own artificially created environments. But mutation is permanent changes to DNA sequence. And if the DNA that's mutated is part of a gene, then that gene is going to be affected. But when I say the word affected, you should never think the effect is always going to be negative. Is that making sense? So that's one association most people tend to have with mutation, that it's bad. Mutation is not always bad. Without mutation, we won't have the diversity we have right now. Does that make sense to you guys? So understand the word natural selection. Natural selection refers to these differences in reproductive success within a population of organisms. That's what natural selection is, okay? So any characteristic that keeps you from moving, passing on genes to the next generation is a characteristic that is not going to show up in the next generation. So then we say that change or difference in reproductive success between this sibling, and this sibling is what natural selection is, okay? And that's Charles Darwin's contribution was he actually provided evidence and data that showed the phenomena. He did not know why what he saw happened, but he recorded what exactly happened, which then explained why organisms might change over time, okay? So what we're seeing here is the 4 observations about the natural world that Charles Darwin made, and which was, you can see, high reproductive capacity. So all organisms reproduce, overproduce. Every organism that sexually reproduces needs to have only 2 offspring, one to replace each parent, but organisms don't do that. So there's high reproductive capacity, and sexually reproducing organisms have heritable variations, meaning they inherit varying combination of traits that then is going to impact their survival. But then because of all this overproduction that they're doing and limited resources means population is going to face some struggle for existence. And when competition gets into the picture, not everybody without the good combination of characteristics can survive that kind of pressure. Right? So then everybody tend to have a slightly different kind of reproductive success, which then will lead to differences in gene frequencies, right, for specific genes in the future, and which leads to evolution. Alrighty. So read about the finches, the example, one of the many organisms Darwin studied in the Galapagos Island. That's the place where his studies or record of his major impactful studies start, okay? So look into it. And then modern synthesis, please go through that too. Modern synthesis is when we take current available data, and using all the different data available, we synthesize a conclusion, right? So Charles Darwin's observations, as I mentioned before, he didn't know exactly why he was seeing those heritable variations. But now we know it's because of mutation, right? The genetic variability is because of mutations, and the mutations, depending on whether they're beneficial, harmful, or have no impact, is of course going to affect how these genes get passed on to the next generation, and they're useful or not useful to the organism. But not only information about genes, but also fossil records, studies on developmental biology, meaning at the embryonic stage, when multicellular organisms develop, you can start seeing the evolutionary connection between all of them. For example, although we are not fish, but we are related to fish, you can see that in the very early stages of our life cycle. And a life cycle of a multicellular organism such as a human being doesn't start after you're born. It starts with the egg and the sperm fusing to form the single cell zygote, right? So when you follow this zygote that's now splitting into many cells using cell division and then maturing and developing into a functional animal, and if you want to take human beings as an example, right? So at certain stages in the embryonic development, we actually have gills, which then later, in our case, because of our collection of genes, is converted to parts of your middle ear, and then the junction between our throat and our mouth called the pharyngeal area. These parts are developed from tissues that are actually gills, right? And look and function like gills could, but they don't develop into gills in us. But those early embryonic development kind of clearly shows our link with those other organisms in the animal kingdom, right? So we study developmental biology, we study ecology, we study biogeography. So when you take all this massive amount of evidence and data and you put them together, then this whole picture starts emerging, and you start seeing that Darwin was actually very correct when he made his deductions based on what he was observing about how evolution happens, right? So he not only said evolution happens, he actually gave the process that's used for evolution, and he provided data for it. So that's why he makes it into textbooks, right? So moving on, here's a picture that shows you the evolutionary connection between the different groups of animal species, right? So here's human hand, there's the forelimb of horse, cat, and a bat. Although at first glance, they all look different, in reality, they actually have a lot of similarities. And when you take a complicated structure like that, and if you start seeing similarities in them, one of the ways they could have had that similarity is because they all came from pretty similar related gene pools. Is that making sense? And then evolved over time. So here is the deal. So somebody is changing at their genetic level. What if what they changed into, the environment really doesn't support that change or characteristic? And the answer is they're going to go extinct. Is that making sense? Okay. For example, right now we have individuals who are naturally resistant to the HIV virus, right? HIV itself is the name of the virus, human immunodeficiency virus. Did they develop a resistance to it? No. HIV was not even a virus of human beings. It was found in primates, and then it jumped host, and now we have a version of it in us. So once we started getting attacked by this virus and it spread through the human population, we then started realizing that there are human beings that are actually naturally resistant to it because of mutations they didn't even know they had. Without HIV in the environment, all of these human beings, both those are HIV resistant and sensitive, would have the exact same reproductive success. It won't be affected, is what I'm saying, by their ability to resist or be sensitive to HIV. But then now that HIV did start spreading among the human populations, now it has become a selective factor, and we are seeing that there are human beings who might have a much better chance of passing on their genes to the next generation because they have a set of mutations that makes them HIV resistant. So do you see how they did not develop the resistance in response to the HIV, but they had the mutation before HIV showed up? That mutation was neither useful nor harmful to them. But now that HIV is around, they're finding out that it's actually useful to them. So mutation is not purposeful. Evolution doesn't happen purposefully. Evolution happens in response to how our mutations and the environment we live in. And when I say the environment we live in, it's just not the food and the water and shelter. I'm also talking about other living things in your environment, those that are pathogenic to you, those that reproduce with you, those that, are predators of you, those that are prey for you. So all this, your genes allow you to find mates, find food, resist diseases, live in certain temperatures, live under certain moisture conditions. So So that's what the environment is that we're talking about, okay? So it's not a purposeful process. It takes a long time to happen. Read up on antibiotic-resistant bacteria and how resistance develops in these bacteria, okay? And how that's a very unique, good example, not unique example, good example of, in our lifetime, actually seeing a population of organisms actually evolve to have antibiotic resistance. So read up about it, and if you have questions about the process of it and you're not getting it, shoot me an email or call me, okay? Because it's a very interesting phenomenon, and understanding it will help you make better decisions, right? Okie dokie. So moving on to classification. So because we have so many life forms, it's useful for us to actually classify them based on their similarities, differences. But like I told you, we're finding out more and more and more about these organisms, and then we're also discovering new organisms. So this graph you're seeing, or not graph, it's a flow chart sort of that you're seeing here. This is not a stable, static tree, right? We call it a phylogenetic tree. That's the technical terminology for it. And as you can see, all life forms, right, are now fit into these different big levels, and then we classify them into smaller and smaller and smaller levels, right? So we have bacteria, we have archaea, and then we have a whole bunch of organisms. As you can see, they're all colored similarly because they're not the same as the blues and the oranges. So bacteria form their own group because of their characteristics. Archaeans form their own group. Who are your archaeans? They're almost like bacteria, but not really quite like bacteria. In fact, if you check their genetics is more closely related to these groups here that look and act unlike archaea, but at the gene level, they're pretty similar to them, okay? Not pretty similar, but more similar than bacteria are to these organisms here, right? So archaeans, let's see, if Yellowstone National Park, those greenish yellowish tinge that you see on those rocks growing next to the geysers, the hot water springs, those are archaeans. Those are examples of archaeans, okay? And then here's a group of organisms that have certain similarities, and that's why they're all kind of colored and grouped together. And they include plants and a bunch of organisms called protists. You guys know sea kelp. You guys know amoeba. Those are protists. Although sea kelp looks like a plant, it's really not a plant. And then we have fungi, right? So bread mold, yeast, right? Yeast that we use for baking, yeast that causes skin infections. They're all yeast. When we use the word yeast, we are referring to fungi that are unicellular. That's where that word comes from. Mold refers to fungi that are multicellular. Of course, you guys have seen mushrooms. It's a fungi too, right? And then animals. So we human beings are under kingdom Animalia, right? So read about the classification, understand the names, and see why these different organisms are grouped differently. What are some of their similarities and differences? So why do we classify things? We classify them because we are natural classifiers. When I say I will meet you by the stand of trees, I just did classification because you just gave someone the impression that you passed on information to somebody that meant look for a stand of really tall organisms that have these brown column-like trunks and green tops that flutters in the wing, and they are rooted to the ground by extensive root system. You didn't have to say all that. All you said is go and find me by the trees, right? And so you would expect them to go there then, rather than going and standing right next to a bunch of bushes by the pond. So classification allows us to convey information in a very efficient manner, right? So if I ask you to think about owls, you're not going to think about bald eagle, because the minute I say owl, I classified a bunch of birds into a very specific group. So classification is very useful for us because it allows us to ponder the differences and similarities. And because you made these two organisms sit in two different domain, that's the level of classification you're looking at here, then there must be some differences between them. So then someone can ask you, if they don't know already, what is the difference between them, and learn about them better. Okay, so read through the classification, and I've given you a little bit of notes here as to how to look at them. So learn about two kinds of cells, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Eukaryotes are cells with internal cell compartments. Prokaryotes are cells that don't have internal cell compartments. One of the cell compartments you're all familiar with is nucleus. You might have heard of chloroplast too. That's another cell compartment. That compartment is specialized to do photosynthesis. You might have heard about mitochondria. That's another cell compartment. It's a compartment that extracts energy from molecules that are shipped into the cell after your digestive system breaks down really large molecules into smaller molecules, correct? So these compartments are called organelles. So if you want to figure out what's the difference between eukaryotes and prokaryotes, is eukaryotes have organelles in them, prokaryotes lack organelles, but please do not hear me say that prokaryotes cannot do the same functions as eukaryotes. In fact, prokaryotes can do some really fancy metabolic processes that the eukaryotic world has not seen yet, okay? So these guys are very important group of organisms. Many of us don't think about them because they are not visible to human eyes, okay? So please learn and study about those groups and know why and what are some key differences between them, okay? In the eukaryotic world, cells with compartments, we have plants. These are multicellular organisms that does photosynthesis, so they make their own organic food. Animals that don't make their own organic food, they depend on plants and other photosynthetic organisms to make their food for them. And they get their food by ingestion. So they take food and digest it on the inside. Fungi are organisms that can be multicellular, unicellular, but they also depend on photosynthetic organisms for their food, but they acquire their food by secreting digestive enzymes to the outside of their body, digest the food outside their structures, and then absorb pre-digested food. So it's almost like if you took an animal and turned it inside out, you got a fungi, right? That's what a fungus is. Protist is a very, very diverse group. So that's why we kind of don't call a protist group a kingdom under eukarya. So these are three domains, and domain eukarya has three kingdoms: plant, animalia, fungi. Protists used to be a kingdom, but then we started discovering more and more organisms under this group, and we decided that we cannot shove them all under one kingdom, right? So now we have them as just a group, and they're working on splitting them up into several kingdoms. Protists display so much diversity. They're unicellular, multicellular, they are colonial organisms, there are photosynthetic protists, and then there are protists that go around and feed like fungi. There are protists that feed like animals. Like I told you, amoeba, unicellular cell that feeds like an animal, whereas kelp looks like a plant, acts like a plant. It's not a plant, right? But it's a protist. So it's a very diverse group. You can also find a lot of photosynthetic organisms in domain bacteria. So when I talk about photosynthetic organisms, you have to think about unicellular bacteria, unicellular and multicellular, protists, and multicellular plants. All of these are photosynthetic organisms, okay? So learn about them more in detail. Alrighty, and then learn about how within the different domains of life, we see so much connectivity, okay? So learn about them. And then you will learn now, starting off with population ecology, right? In population ecology, we study populations and why their numbers changes over time. You already know what the word population stands for, so know that. And then read about why we need to study population ecology. Is there any benefit to human beings and the planet in us studying population ecology? You betcha. All of this, right? So read through them, okay? And then what do exactly population ecologists study? So they study population size, population density, growth rate of population, and why and how those numbers change over time. And here are a lot of different factors that we're going to go through. You guys are going to be reading one by one that affects how and why those numbers change over time, okay? So here's a formula for growth rate. Remember, growth rate does not talk about whole numbers. It's not how many people were born in Franklin County. The question always is how many new births did we have for every 1,000 people in Franklin County, right? So growth rate is given by birth rate, and you subtract death rate from it. That's the growth rate, and it's expressed as a percent. Go through this example I have given you to see how we come up with that form, or how we use the formula. And then here we are showing how we calculate population size changes, growth rates, right? At a global level. At a global level, the only way new human beings, or any organism for that matter, right? Because we're not just talking about human beings here. When new organisms join a population, how do they come about? By birth. When they leave this globe, how do they leave? By death, right? So R is equal to B minus D is the formula for calculating global changes in population growth. But local changes in population growth, people can be born, people can pass away, but then we also have people moving in and moving out. So immigration and emigration have to be taken into account when we are studying population size at the local level, right? So you can see the formula is slightly different for it. So go through that, okay? And then dispersal, and why dispersal is important, right? When we study populations, because dispersal means new gene pool is coming in, moving out, and that can affect populations, and it can affect our decisions about how to manage populations, okay? So please go through that, alrighty. Okay, and then we are going to start with talking about what is the maximum population growth possible for a specific population. Again, remember, population refers to a group of organisms that belongs to the same species, correct? So this term here that says intrinsic rate of increase, right? What is it? It's the rate of increase that a population of organisms shows under ideal condition. That's their maximum population growth. But you guys know, under even ideal condition, a cockroach is not, their population is not going to grow at the same rate as that of a population of elephants. Does that make sense to you guys? So there are a lot of what we call life history characteristics that changes the value for this intrinsic rate of increase from population to population, right? So here are some life history characteristics, right? So there are, of course, differences in species, age at which reproduction begins, number of reproductive periods per lifetime, right? And then number of offsprings produced during each reproductive period. And because of it, a human being cannot increase in a household, let's say, a household cannot increase in its size, the family cannot increase in its size for a human being as fast as you know, maybe your pet dog, because their number of when reproduction begins in them is earlier, number of reproductive periods per lifetime is also more, and they also have more offsprings during each reproductive period, which then automatically changes the biotic potential or intrinsic rate of increase for each organism. Okay, and under ideal condition, when all variables that would affect population growth are not anymore stressed and limited, then an organism can, or a population can show exponential growth, right? So exponential growth looks like this. So here is a growth chart of bacteria grown in lab condition where everything is provided for them and everything is taken care of for them. If you do that under ideal condition, within 10 hours, you start with one bacteria, and that's how many bacteria came into the picture. That's exponential growth. You go from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8. They're all exponents, right? So under ideal condition, exponential growth is what's displayed by organisms. So the exponential growth, when you plot it on a graph, looks like a J-shaped curve. A J-shaped curve is a very good indicator. You're looking at exponential growth, which is not challenged by anything, right? When you're not challenged by anything, that's the kind of growth rate all organisms show. But you guys know that's not possible in reality, right? So there are a lot of factors that play into limiting this kind of exponential growth, at least forever, right? Cannot happen forever. And those limiting factors manifest as what we call environmental resistance. So availability of food, water, shelter, spread of diseases, predators. These are all environmental resistances that manifest as negative feedback. So when the population of organisms go up, the environmental resistances are also going up with it, and at some point it's going to block this exponential increase in population. It might not completely chop off population growth, but it's not going to allow that J-shaped growth curve to be extending and increasing in height, right? We use a term called carrying capacity, which refers to the maximum number of individuals an environment can support indefinitely, meaning that organism or population of organisms must be using the resources in a more sustainable manner. So what is that number for each population? That if you stayed within that number, that particular environment can support your population indefinitely. That's the carrying capacity for that species. Every species has a different number for carrying capacity. As you know, it's an ecosystem doesn't have to provide the same amount of resources and kind of resources for a herd of elephants as it does for I don't know, a small bug of some kind. Does that make sense? So carrying capacity is different. And for human beings, especially, this K value is a moving value, because how much we take from an ecosystem depends on what kind of resources we use, renewable or non-renewable, how much of those resources we use. So there are a lot of things that we could do that could change the carrying capacity of the ecosystem for Homo sapiens, right? So you have to understand for human beings that K value is actually, we can play with it if we knew how that K value changes with our choices, right, to use our environment, okay? So carrying capacity of an ecosystem is going to level off exponential growth. When exponential growth levels off, it looks like this. So then it becomes an S-shaped plot, right? And we call that the logistic growth curve. So as you can see, every organism in any ecosystem shows logistic growth curve because the negative feedback kicks in and flattens out that J, right? So we are seeing a much more manageable population for the ecosystem, alrighty? But this never stays in one spot. It goes up and down, up and down, up and down. But as long as the population doesn't crash, then the population is responding correctly to these limiting factors and not overshooting the carrying capacity. That's the term we use for it, right? Overshooting carrying capacity will lead to a population crash. So an abrupt decline in population density. Read about the reindeers in Pribilof Island and how we introduced about eight of them, I think. 26 of them in 1910. Because of the lack of any natural predators, these guys just went through the roof, and apparently they went past their carrying capacity because can you see that population crash happening? So the carrying capacities must have been somewhere around here, and they didn't respond to it, okay, because it's really not their, I wouldn't say their natural ecosystem, but then the community structure, they usually would keep their population under check was not there. So we started with 26 in Pribilof Island of reindeer. It shot up to 2,000 within about 25 years, and then it came crashing down. And you can see in 1950, there was only 8 left. That's smaller than the 26 we introduced, right? So that's what happens when a population doesn't respond to it. Right now, human population is showing exponential growth. And at some point, we are also going to overshoot our carrying capacity. And this is exactly what's going to happen to us too, because we might have an opposable thumb and have capabilities that are a little different from other organisms. But we are also a living thing that's dependent on our environment, right? Okie dokie. So what then we are talking about in this chapter is factors that affect population size. So factors can either be density dependent or they can be density independent, meaning those factors that whose effect will depend on how big a population is and how dense it is. That's density dependent factor. Factors that really don't depend on whether a population is big or small are density independent factors. For example, spread of diseases, competition of food and other resources, predation. All this varies all over the year and season based on density of another population, okay? And it can sometimes cause boom or bust cycles. So please read through them. Lemmings are a good example of lemmings are a good example of the boom or bust cycle. And then read up about how when lemming population goes up and down, their predator population also goes up and down, right? And you can kind of match those two cycles together, oscillations together. Density independent factors, those factors that really don't get their effect on the population is not dependent on the population size, is factors like frost, blizzard, fire, flooding, right? It really doesn't matter how big a population is, flooding is going to happen and organisms in the way are going to get affected, right? But then there are also examples where density dependent factors and independent factors are interrelated. So read up about how sheep and penguins survive winter and the frost and the ice and the cold temperature are density independent factors. But then if the herd of sheep is large enough, that herd can weather that changed condition much better than a small herd of sheep or a small flock of penguins. I'm not sure if flock is the correct word to use for a group of penguins, so check that one too, okay? Alrighty, then moving on to talking about something called reproductive strategies. So these are also factors that affect population growth rate. Reproductive strategies refers to based on how organisms reproduce, or how organisms reproduce is based on a lot of other factors, okay? We have limited resources, all organisms, and they have to use the resources among a lot of different life activities, growing, hunting, saving oneself from predators and diseases. Your immune system soaks up a lot of energy every single day, okay? And reproduction is another process that takes energy. So when you are constantly playing trade-offs between those different life activities you have to do. So based on how organisms, species tend to divvy up their energy between which one of those characteristics, right? Lifestyle characteristics. We can either classify organisms as R selected, meaning they are more in tune with growing their population, their growth rates are pretty high, or they're K selected, meaning these are populations that don't grow really fast at all, so they're more geared towards meeting the carrying capacity value for their population. And of course, it's a huge spectrum. It's not either this or that. There are a lot of organisms that are in between these two extremes. But then understanding these extremes kind of allows us to understand how an organism that grows at a really fast, or a population that grows at a really fast rate, the organisms tend to have small body size, early maturity, very short lifespan, large broods, little or no parental care, like mosquitoes, dandelions, right? Probability of long-term survival is pretty low, but these organisms do tend to have pretty high growth rates. On the other hand, those organisms that show slower growth rates tend to have smaller broods, longer lifespans, like redwood trees, human beings, slow development, meaning they don't reproductively mature very fast, so you can start reproduction very early on in your life. Large body size, late reproduction, low reproductive rates. We don't tend to have a whole lot of babies at any given time. So these are organisms that are supposed to be K-selected species, right? So those are called life history strategies that determine then what your reproductive strategy is, right? And also another reproductive strategy is survivorship. Survivorship talks about the probability of any individual in surviving to a specific age in an environment. The age groups that are that display the most survivability is different from species to species. You guys know, if you take a frog, its chances of dying is much higher in egg stage and tadpole stage than in the frog stage, right? But in human beings, because of medical advances, our chances of declining starts getting higher and higher as we get older, not when we are younger. So survivorship curves were actually created and invented by insurance companies so they can calculate your premiums. But now we also use it for population ecology. So basically we have three main kinds of survivorships, right? Type 1, 2, 3. And you can see type 1, human beings are a good example of it. The young and the middle age have higher survivability than the old. In type 3, which is the right opposite of type 1, the young have least survivability, like a fish. But after you get to adulthood, everybody, until they pass away, even until much older age, their survival rates are pretty similar. But if you take something like a garden lizard faces the exact same risks for survival at all age groups. But of course, with increase in age, the population seems to decline, because then the longer you live, chances of you not surviving also gets pretty high, right? So that's a survivorship curve that shows you which age group in a population makes up most of the population. So if you are thinking about protecting a species of organism, knowing that data is very, very important, because where are you going to be placing most of your protective measures? That's a question to know, right? Okie dokie. Moving on, please read about metapopulations and how organisms tend to distribute themselves, right, into habitat patches across landscape based on their abilities and available factors. So read about that. And then moving on to communities, right? So we talked about populations. Now moving on to communities, which are all populations that lives in a very specific environment at the same time and interact with one another. Here are some characteristics of biological communities. And here is an example that goes into more details about how communities are nested. There are large communities, and then there's community within a community within a community. So for example, if you take the overall community of a tropical rainforest, right? And then if you found a dead log like this on the forest floor, the kind of organisms that live there and the abiotic characteristics in that particular environment is going to be very, very unique compared to the entire forest, right? So you can have nested communities and very, very diverse interactions within communities. Communities vary in size. They lack precise boundaries, okay? And they're rarely isolated, rarely, okay? Alrighty, and then learn about the term ecological niche. Ecological niche is not the same as habitat. Habitat is where you live. Niche is what you do. Is that making sense? So when someone says, I found my niche, they're saying they have found what they are good at, not where they're living. That's not their niche, right? So learn about what would decide the niche of an organism, okay? And learn about limiting resources that then decides the niche and habitat of an organism, okay? Limiting resources are any environmental resource that, because it is scarce or it is at unfavorable level. For example, pond lilies need a lot of water. Cactus doesn't need a lot of water. If you threw a pond lily on land, that's scarcity of a very key resource it needs. But if you took a cactus and dropped it into a pond, that's also unfavorable levels of a resource, right? So any resource, if it's in some kind of unfavorable level, will restrict the ecological niche of an organism, is called a limiting resource. So know some examples, know how to identify limiting resources for different organisms, okay? And then niches can also be decided, can be classified into two kinds. Okay, let me see. Okay, what happened to my slide? Alrighty, so you can have two kinds of niches. You can have realized niches and fundamental niches, okay? Here are the words. Can you see them? Fundamental niche, realized niche. Fundamental niche is what you have. Realized niche is what you end up having after another species who tends to share part or more than a part of your niche, because of competition excludes you from your own niche, right? So for example, I don't have an example. Okay, this is not good. Before I post the PowerPoint, I will make sure that I include the slide. So these green and brown circles here show you, are indicative of green and brown anole. Green anole is a native of Florida. Brown anole is a native of Cuba. Read about how brown anole was over competitive and therefore excluded the green anole from most of its range, right? We actually have a term for it called competitive exclusion. Okay, so read about that. And then here are community interactions. So you know what communities are, how they're put together, and you know the sizes and their characteristics. But then within a community, what kind of interactions do organisms have with each other? And there are several kinds, and we can group them broadly into competition, symbiosis, and predation. And we talked about competition with brown and green anole. Whenever species share resources, there's going to be competition, and somebody is going to get more than the lion's share, right? So read about the P. aurelia P. caudatum refers to kinds of protists. Do you remember protists we talked about in the beginning of the chapter? Protists are, in this protist, it's a unicellular aquatic freshwater organism. And of course, there are several species of them out there, Paramecium caudatum, Paramecium aurelia, two such species they studied in this particular study. And they wanted to know, when they put these two species together, which one was capable of outcompeting whom. But then the researchers asked themselves, why is that in a lab condition? P. aurelia is always the one that comes out the winner. P. caudatum is always the one that loses the battle for in competition. And how they figured out what makes this not happen in natural ecosystems. In natural ecosystems, P. aurelia and P. caudatum show pretty much the same population levels, right? Numbers. So what is different between the actual environment and the lab environment that they study these guys in? And we will learn about a few of those feedback mechanisms in place that allows for these different groups of organisms that compete with one another to still coexist, okay? So we call this interspecific competition, competition within between different species of the same genus. And then here are some examples of what would happen when you compete for the same resources. If you compete for the same resources, you can either see competitive exclusion, or we can see resource partitioning, where species do coexist with one another, right? So read about what competitive exclusion is and what conditions lead to them. Read about resource partitioning and how in resource partitioning, species that compete for the same resources are still capable of coexisting with one another. Alrighty, and then the discussion moves on to symbiosis. Symbiosis refers to whenever two organisms live in pretty close association with one another. We call that interaction symbiosis. But then depending on whether the members benefit or don't benefit or get harmed, we can have mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. There are a lot of examples examples that your textbook, discusses. Please go through them. And I'm going to give you some ideas about how to pronounce these words. This is mycorrhizal. Myco part of this word, mycology, study of fungus. Myco refers to fungi. Rhizae refers to root. These fungi are called mycorrhizal fungi because these are fungi that inhabit the root system of plants and do amazing beneficial things for plants. So please learn about that mutualistic relationship, okay? And then here's another example of mutualism between photosynthetic algae and marine corals. You all know the corals that we know are colored, and the colors come from these algae, photosynthetic algae. We call them zooxanthellae, right? Zooxanthellae is how we name them. So read about that symbiotic relationship, okay? And there are more interactions here, which is commensalism. Commensalism is a symbiotic relationship where one species benefits, but the other one is not affected by the interaction at all, okay? Again, I need to change all these EXs, for example, okay? But anyway, moving on to actual topics under discussion here. This word is, the way you say it is epiphytes. Epi means on top, phyte refers to plant. Epiphytes are plants that grow on top of other plants, okay? Orchids are good examples of epiphytes. So learn about why, first of all, these plants grow on top of other plants. And in this interaction, how come one plant is benefited by it, but the other plant isn't? Because we are classifying this as commensalism, right? So learn about it. Okay, very cool. If you go to the botanical garden in their dome area, the climatarium they have a lot of epiphytes. So epiphytes tend to be plants you tend to see in really thick grown forests, like the tropical rainforest, the temperate rainforest, right? And something about those forests, epiphytes, having that interaction allows epiphytes to survive in those environments. So please read about it. And of course, parasitism, where it's a symbiotic relationship where one organism benefits, but the other is harmed by it, okay? If a parasite causes an illness, we call it a pathogen. Ticks are good examples of ectoparasites, right? And there are a lot of endoparasites that they should have examples for you in your textbook, so please read about them. Pathogens and parasites, depending on how they affect their host, we can tell whether they have evolved with their host for a long time, or are they new parasites? Because evolved parasites are parasites that will not harm their host immediately. So it's almost like, you are nurturing this golden egg-laying goose for a long time. There is no benefit to a parasite if it kills its host immediately. So evolved parasites, meaning the host and the parasite has been evolving together. I know this is kind of like making some of you nauseous, so I'm going to skip the picture there. So when the parasite and the host has had a chance to evolve for a very long time, a parasite that's a well-evolved parasite is a parasite that keeps its host alive for the longest time possible. Parasites that once you get parasitized by them brings and crashes the system of the host very quickly are those that are not yet evolved well. Okay, all right, what was the other thing I was about to tell you? Okay, get familiar with the word vector. Vector is not a host for a parasite, but vector is something that carries a parasite and moves it from one host to another. Malarial parasite uses mosquitoes as their vector. Is that making sense? So please know that word. Alrighty, moving on to predation. Predation is when one species consumes another species. Okay, so predators come in two forms, carnivores and herbivores. Usually when we think about predators, we don't think of cows as predators, but ask the grass it's eating whether it's getting preyed upon or not, right? So if you are preying on plant matter, you're an herbivore. If you're preying on animal matter, you are a carnivore. But then again, evolutionarily speaking, and a plant or animal that cannot put up some resistance to this predation is a plant or animal that's an extinct plant or animal. So those plants and animals that still survive have had some genetic changes in them that allowed them to not wipe out predation completely, but to withstand predation, right? So you're going to learn a lot about the prey and predator adaptations. Prey adapt to avoid too much predation. Predators adapt to increase their ability to prey. So you're going to read about those. And then here, the slide kind of points out to the two basic mechanisms, right, of predation. Either you pursue your prey, run after it, chase after it, catch it, eat it, or ambush by camouflage or using attracting lures that looks like food, but you are actually walking straight into the mouth of your predator, right? So read about them, alrighty. So plants cannot flee predators, duh. So what kind of adaptations should they have to, again, not avoid predation, but to decrease the intensity of them, right? So there are some extremely cool adaptations, both in the plant and animal and bacterial, protist, and fungi world that mainly is in place to either become a better predator or become a prey that doesn't get preyed upon too often, right? So read about them, understand them. And then defensive adaptations in animals, right? Again, there are a lot of different adaptations, mechanical defenses, living in group, warning colorations, right? So read about those. And then, cryptic coloration, which means these are colorations that allows them to camouflage better. Right? Okie dokie. And then moving on to a kind of species called keystone species. Keystone species are species that we tend to underestimate until they get wiped out, and then we sit there and we go, what just happened? What happened is we were too quick in wiping out the species without thinking about the long-term effects of it, and now we are paying the price for it. Human beings, history is peppered with a lot of examples like that, but we still tend to trudge through without thinking too much because we think for some reason we can live without the help of any of these organisms, and we are time and time again proved wrong, and it's a shame that we haven't learned our lesson since then. History is filled with those examples. It is our responsibility to educate ourselves, right? If you don't, then we are going to be losing the battle again, kind of deal. So learn about keystone species. Keystone species are usually species that are lower in number in the population. In the animal world, keystone species. So keystone species is something we can see in every community. But if you're taking animal world as an example, they are usually predators, okay? Gray wolf is a really good example of a keystone species. So keystone is that stone that's right there in the middle of a arch, holding an arch together. These species are called keystone species to kind of focus, put some limelight on the fact that if you remove this just one stone from the head of the arch, the entire arch comes collapsing. It's a perfect term if there was one to explain a species and its importance and role in the ecosystem, right? So learn about keystone species, know your plant and animal examples of keystone species. And then the discussion goes into what would affect species richness in a community, right? What are some factors involved? You guys already learned a while ago that a community's stability depends on species richness, because when there is a lot of different kinds of species, there interactions between them is also very, very diverse, and that's a very stable ecosystem is what we talked about. But then you also know, naturally speaking, not all parts of this globe have the exact same species richness, right? So you're going to read about what are some factors that naturally, even without human beings in the equation, naturally affect species richness. And therefore, when human beings go trudging into these ecosystems, this awareness should give us pause, and our use of these ecosystems should not be the same, right? We should tailor our use of the ecosystem based on how stable or not stable or sensitive it is. Alrighty, talking about ecosystem services, species richness directly relates to ecosystem services. The services a desert provides is not as much as services a coral reef provides. Species richness is the difference there, right? And then here is a table that goes through the different ecosystem services different ecosystems provide. So please read through it, know it, understand it, remember it. And then community stability, you guys already know. Community stability and its resilience to change or disturbances depends on its species richness, right? And then read about gardens as ecosystems, talking about sustainable gardening. Don't grow daffodils where daffodils should not be growing, is where that's going. And then the last part of this chapter is about development of a community. Community doesn't stay still. It evolves over time. And I'm using that word evolution in a very untraditional manner. I just want you to know that this has nothing to do with the evolution we talked about. So rather than saying evolves over time, let's say it changes over time, right? If you have ever driven past a abandoned field day in and day out, year after year, you know it's not going to sit there looking exactly like the first day it was abandoned, right? You see plant life changing, animal life changing, the whole outlook of that particular plot changing. That's what we call succession, right? Succession can be two kinds, primary, secondary succession. Know what the differences are, okay? Know your example for primary succession. So primary succession happens in environments where there is no soil to begin with. Without soil, there is no producer, and without a producer, it's very hard to build up a community, right? So primary succession talks about when that's the case. Secondary succession is when soil is already present, and there is also what we call biological legacy present, meaning there are spores, there are plant materials, organic matter. So things, if the environment allows them to, helps them to, can sprout and grow. In primary succession on a bare rock, you don't have organic matter. You don't have seeds and spores for things to pop up and develop from. So you have to start at the bottom of the barrel. And this word right here, it's called lichens. You guys have seen lichens. I want you to go on Google image and search lichens, okay? And next time you're out in the woods looking at other areas, you look for lichens. They're everywhere. Lichens are organisms that are actually made of two different organisms put together. They are fungi and photosynthetic algae put together. Photosynthetic algae is going to do photosynthesis. Fungi, you guys know, secrete digestive enzyme to the outside of their body, digest everything on the outside. That's key here because there is no soil, but those lichens are capable of still digesting and extracting things from their surrounding, nutrients from their surroundings, which then feeds the algae, and the algae does photosynthesis with them. But because the lichens are constantly chemically attacking the rocks on which they're growing, and then when you get rain, the rain freezes, the cracks opens up more, wind pelts them, and all this creates tiny cracks with little bitty soil materials in them, which then allows plants like mosses to take root, right? Mosses don't have root, by the way, but it allows them to put down their holdfast, which is root-like structures they have. And when they start doing that, the cracks get wider and wider, more soil is created, then things with actual root systems start growing, breaks down the rock more, then shrubs come into play, and all these things are dying and adding more organic matter into the soil, which are then nutrients that the decomposers like bacteria, worms, and fungi can make back into simpler nutrients that can then go back into the food chain again, which then leads to forest growth. So this is primary succession, takes a lot of years. Secondary succession compared to primary succession doesn't happen at such a slow rate, because remember, we already have soil, right? All we need is starter material. So here are pictures showing you the primary succession on a glacier or field where glacier has just moved away and exposed just rock, bare rocks, right? Sterile areas. Alrighty. And then secondary succession and abandoned farmland or a open area after, say, a fire, you still have soil there, organic matter there. That's secondary succession. Here is an actual example your textbook discusses, an abandoned farm field in North Carolina. Study that succession there, okay? Alrighty, so that's the end of this chapter. As I said, we talked about evolution being one of the reasons why we have so much diversity. And then we talked about population ecology, and then we talked about community structure and the different parts of it. A lot of little details. Please don't ever think about skimming just the top of these details. Go through all of them. Take good notes, okay? And if you have any questions, email me, and I'll see you in the next chapter. Thank you so much.